Hi, I'm Ben Felder with the Oklahoman. It's Wednesday, November 28th, and joining me here in the Oklahoman studio is Justin Wingerter, a couple days before our official political state episode, but we decided to talk a little politics today, particularly about Governor-elect Kevin Stitt's appointment for his Secretary of Energy and Environment, and that is going to be Kenneth Wagner. Governor-elect Stitt is kind of in the process of filling out his transition team, and probably not a lot of people know much about Wagner, but he does have a connection with, shall we say, a ghost of Oklahoma's political past, and that is former State Attorney General, former EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt. Pruitt hired Wagner at the EPA. Yep. Wagner and Pruitt went back to law school together, were partners in a minor league baseball team here in Oklahoma City, and part of a house deal that the New York Times broke a story on earlier this year. But real quick, Justin, Pruitt, what's the latest with him, or how did things end for him this year? You get 30 seconds to describe the Pruitt ordeal.
To explain all of that. I mean, he had to leave office under about a dozen ethics investigations. It was pretty well known earlier this year, and the scandals added up. They clouded what seemed to be a quick and meteoric political rise for Scott Pruitt, and threw all of that into question. We don't know what he'll do next politically. Yeah.
So if you're a Democrat or you're a Stitt opponent, you were really blasting this decision, and you're probably focusing on that Pruitt decision. Sure. Now, if you were in the oil and gas industry, which is prominent here in Oklahoma, you probably are praising this. Maybe not because of the connection to Pruitt per se, but that this was someone that Pruitt brought to the EPA, and the EPA has been seen as a lot more friendlier towards the fossil fuel industry. Now, to be fair, I did talk to the Stitt campaign, and they said that, listen, his connection with Pruitt wasn't even a consideration for us. He was a prominent attorney in Tulsa, had done some good work at the EPA, and that's why we picked him. But, I mean, if you are in the oil and gas industry, and we've heard from some, they see this as a positive pick. An Oklahoman who went to the EPA coming back that you have to think is going to really be mindful of that balance between energy and the environment.
I mean, Pruitt's argument while he was at the EPA, Trump's argument has always been that those two sides are not at odds, energy and environment. And the state position here is the secretary of both. You oversee both. They're often at odds, let's face it. I mean, those two sides are often at odds. And we'll see which side he goes to. I mean, if he favors one over the other, and if he is seen as favoring one over the other, like Pruitt did, then he's going to make some enemies probably here in the state. He will oversee, among other things, the State Department of Environmental Quality, which is kind of the state version of the EPA. And Pruitt ran into a lot of flack running the EPA in the way he did. He was seen as politicizing it. And look, I mean, a lot of people who go to college who want to work at something like the EPA or DEQ are not your Scott Pruitt conservatives. Let's face it, I mean, some are, I'm sure. But by and large, if you have environmental work in your history, if you are passionate about that, you're probably more on the Democratic or liberal end of the spectrum. And if you're seen as running an agency in a very conservative way, when many of the people who work for you are not along those lines, and that you could see some butting of heads there. Scott Pruitt ran into that a lot. He had a lot of people within the agency who were ready for him to go. Many of them were leaking anything they could to the press. They were just making his job a little harder, and he was making their job a little harder. That just didn't work very well. That's because he was seen as running the agency in a political way. We'll see if that happens here at the state level. It doesn't necessarily have to happen. You can be a conservative running an agency and just more or less let the agency do what it's been doing.
Yeah, and I had someone today tell me that said, listen, Pruitt's personal troubles aside, he had a talented staff around him that worked hard. Let's face it. I mean, Pruitt's departure from D.C. was largely not because of how he ran EPA matters. I mean, in some ways, you could say that he was probably the most effective at running an agency in the way that Trump would want it. It was those kind of ethical scandals and that cloud of ethic complaints, that really dogged him. And it wasn't anything new there. I mean, as Attorney General, he spent a lot of money in the office, kind of enlarged that department. But when it came to how he managed the environment versus the energy, he had a lot of praise from the president, and he had a lot of praise back here. And, you know, we talk about the New York Times that did a couple exposés on Pruitt. There was one story that talked about how his office as state attorney general would kind of coordinate its messaging with the oil and gas industry. And what I remember about that story is when it came out, there were a lot of people on the coast, a lot of Democrats nationally who just thought this is the worst thing in the world. I heard from a lot of people in Oklahoma who were like, what's the big deal? That's what we want our attorney general to do, is to have a close relationship with our big oil and gas companies. So, you know, the scandals aside, and, you know, I don't think it's, you know, if you're an opponent of Stitt or opponent of Pruitt, you may be quick to say, hey, you hired one of his partners, he carries that baggage well, or as well. But Stitt is saying that, no, this is a guy that has managed the EPA in a way that we like, which has that balance of energy versus environment. But as you say, they often are, you know, at odds with each other.
Yeah. Well, both sides probably, I mean, see it the way that they see it. I mean, you're right. Democrats are going to jump on this and accuse or criticize this decision, and conservatives or people who are already pretty aligned with Kevin Stitt are probably okay with it. I will say, Pruitt's, you're right. I mean, Pruitt's policy is pretty easily defensible if you're a conservative, if you're inclined to think that way. His ethics get a lot harder to defend, especially that sort of spending. I mean, out of control spending, or it's perceived as frivolous personal spending, you know, with taxpayer dollars. That stuff's just never popular. It's not popular in Oklahoma. It's not popular in California, Massachusetts. It doesn't matter. That anything that looks like you're spending taxpayer dollars on yourself is harder to overcome, and it'd be fascinating to see what kind of political career he has, if any, after this, because. And this is a question we've been asking for 6 months, but it's not new, especially. But it's interesting because those are things that are really hard to come back from. Those sort of ethics things. Yeah. Again, the policy you could overcome. Democrats and liberals are not going to like it. Environmentalists certainly aren't going to like it. Conservatives will. You can have that debate. The ethics stuff gets a lot harder. You get a lot fewer defenders when it's that sort of stuff. Yeah,
well, when Pruitt went to Washington, he took quite a few of those around him with him, and some of those are returning, including now Wagner, to work in the Stitt administration. And I also think it's important to point out that Governor Mary Fallin, she combined the role of Secretary of Environment and Secretary of Energy back in 2013, and one of the directives is to develop policies that encourage the responsible, but encourage the increasing energy production in Oklahoma, which is such an important industry here in the state. So this isn't just about protecting the environment from a hands-off stance like you may see some in some other states. This is about, hey, we want to protect the environment, we also want to protect an industry that's pretty big here, and so Wagner will be tapped with being the chief member of the Stitt cabinet to try to balance the energy sector and environment sector here in Oklahoma. Well, Justin, thanks for joining me as we talk a little bit about Governor-elect Kevin Stitt as he continues to put together his new administration preparing to take office in January.